The Resonance Matrix Volume 2 Episode 5 Provocation, Entering the Reaction Economy. Hello, and welcome back to the Resonance Matrix Volume 2 The Anatomy of Influence, the Linguistic Somatic Decode, where language is not treated as description, persuasion, or metaphor, but as biological software. Here, words are not neutral carriers of meaning. They are signals. They move through the nervous system, shape perception, and organize behavior long before conscious thought has time to intervene. If you're arriving here for the first time, take a moment to orient. This series does not ask you to agree. It does not ask you to react. It does not ask you to take a side. It asks you to notice what happens in the body when certain words, tones, or narratives enter your field, to notice how quickly sensation appears, how fast does urgency form, how often action precedes understanding, and to notice without judgment how often that sequence has been reversed. In Volume 1, we mapped the architecture of the field, the environment, systems, and collective atmospheres that shape perception before an individual ever speaks. We examined how power does not need to announce itself when it can structure the conditions of attention. Volume 2 moves closer, more intimate, more precise. Here the focus is not the environment, but the interface, the point at which language meets the nervous system. Each episode in this volume examines a single linguistic operation, not as an idea, but as a felt event, a word or pattern that leaves a trace in the body, a shift that happens before explanation, a moment where sovereignty is either preserved or quietly surrendered. So far in this volume, we've traced the descent carefully. We began with propaganda, not as lies, but as synthetic coherence, the saturation of a field with a single narrative frequency until the individual can no longer distinguish internal signal from background noise. Propaganda was the field's setup, the atmosphere you breathe without noticing the air. From there, we moved into dogmatism, the hardening of internal ground, where nuance collapses, where certainty becomes safety, and where belief stops being provisional and starts becoming identity. Dogmatism was not aggression, it was rigid, the elimination of flexibility in favor of psychological stability. Then came instigation, the moment movement entered the system, where urgency replaced clarity, where time is compressed, where the nervous system mobilized before meaning had time to land. Instigation was not persuasion, it was an activation, motion introduced before orientation. In the last episode, we crossed a threshold with deception, not deception as lying, but as fractured reality, the point where perception no longer settles cleanly, where explanations feel close but incomplete, where the body registers an acrid aftertaste, a subtle sense that something is off, even when language appears coherent. Each of these stages prepared the nervous system for what comes next. And now we arrive at provocation. Provocation is not an escalation in volume. It is an escalation in precision. Up until now, influence has largely operated at the level of the field, shaping atmosphere, belief, urgency, and perception. With provocation, the focus narrows. The system is no longer interested in what you believe. It is interested to see how you react. Provocation marks the entry into what we'll call the reaction economy, a space where emotional response becomes currency, where activation becomes data, and where your nervous system's reflexes are no longer incidental but valuable. This is the beginning of tactical engagement, not because someone is attacking you, but because your responses are now informative. From the perspective of the mirror linguistic hypothesis, provocation is an acoustic strike, a targeted linguistic or tonal stimulus designed to bypass reflective processing and trigger a rapid autonomic shift. The goal is not dialogue. It is an extraction. Reaction reveals thresholds. Reaction reveals identity sensitivities. Reaction reveals what matters and what hurts. And once revealed, those patterns can be repeated, refined, and exploited. Importantly, provocation does not feel like manipulation. It often feels justified, necessary, personal. It may arrive as a comment that lingers, a joke that lands just wrong, a moral accusation framed as concern, a dismissal disguised as humor, a silence that feels loaded. The nervous system responds before the mind can label what happened. Heat rises, breath catches, muscles prepare, words rush forward. In that moment, something subtle occurs. The ineffable gap, the space between stimulus and response where sovereignty resides, and collapses. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is not a lack of self-awareness. It is a biological event. Provocation exploits the nervous system's prioritization of threat, status, and belonging. It recruits ancient survival circuitry, not because you are weak, but because you are human. This episode is not about suppressing reaction. It is not about becoming indifferent or detached. It is not about winning interactions. It is about restoring the sequence. Because when sensation is allowed to arrive before interpretation, and interpretation before action, provocation loses its leverage. The body still feels. The signal still registers. But choice returns. Throughout this episode, you'll be invited to observe provocation not as an interpersonal failure, but as a field operation, something that happens to nervous systems, not because of personalities. You'll notice how provocation functions across contexts. In digital spaces designed to monetize outrage, in workplaces that reward reaction over reflection, in relationships where tension is used to regulate connection, in moral frameworks that demand immediate alignment, you'll begin to recognize a crucial shift. Provocation does not need your agreement, it needs your activation. As we move through this episode, there is no requirement to act differently, no instruction to confront or withdraw, no demand to correct the world. The work here is observational, to feel the moment when a reaction is invited, to notice the body's readiness to respond, to recognize the urge without obeying it. Because the moment you can feel provocation without becoming it, the field changes. Not externally, internally, and internal reference, once restored, quietly reorganizes everything else. So take a breath, not to calm yourself, but to arrive. This episode is not urgent. Nothing here requires immediate response, and that already is the first act of sovereignty. The atmospheric hook, the charged pause provocation, rarely arrives as noise. More often, it arrives as a pause that feels loaded, a moment that hangs just long enough to be noticed, a comment that doesn't fully resolve, a silence that carries pressure. Nothing overt is said, and yet something has already happened in the body. The nervous system registers it immediately. Muscle tone shifts, breath shortens, attention sharpens, not because danger has been confirmed, but because something has been signaled. This is the signature of provocation at the atmospheric level. Before words are analyzed, before meaning is assigned, the body senses a change in the relational field, a subtle increase in charge, a feeling that something is about to be required. This is how provocation begins, not as confrontation, but as anticipation. From the perspective of the mirror linguistic hypothesis, this moment represents a microshift in the field's acoustic coherence. Tone, timing, or implication introduces a stimulus that the nervous system interprets as salient. The signal does not need to be explicit. It only needs to register as potentially relevant to survival, status, or belonging. The body leans forward before the mind has decided to. This leaning is not a choice. It is a reflex. Provocation works because it does not announce itself as an influence. It presents itself as unfinished business, something unresolved, something that invites completion. And the human nervous system is exquisitely sensitive to incompletion, an unanswered question, a vague accusation, a dismissive laugh, a look held for half a second too long. Each creates a small tear in perceptual continuity, a gap that the body feels compelled to close. This compulsion is not a psychological weakness. It is biological efficiency. The nervous system evolved to resolve uncertainty quickly. Unresolved signals cost energy. They disrupt prediction. They interfere with orientation. Provocation exploits this efficiency by creating tension without direction. Nothing is demanded explicitly. Nothing is stated clearly, but something is implied. An implication is enough. The charged pause is therefore not empty. It is pregnant with expectation. It places the burden of resolution onto the listener, the observer, the recipient. Will you respond? Will you clarify? Will you defend? Will you correct? The provocation does not care which option you choose. What matters is that you move. In this way, provocation differs fundamentally from instigation. Instigation compresses time and pushes the system toward action. Provocation sharpens focus and waits. It holds tension just long enough for your nervous system to reveal itself. From the outside, provocation can appear subtle, even benign. From the inside, it feels anything but. There is often a brief moment of confusion. Was that directed at me? Did they mean something by that? Am I supposed to respond? This uncertainty is not incidental. It is structural. Provocation thrives in ambiguity because ambiguity forces the nervous system into predictive mode. The brain begins scanning for threat, status cues, and social consequences. Attention narrows. The body prepares. In mirror linguistics hypothesis, MLH, and mirror linguistic hypothesis field theory, MLHFT terms, the field has just shifted from resonance to extraction. The signal is no longer inviting shared meaning. It is probing for a reaction. This probing does not require hostility. In fact, overt aggression is often counterproductive. The most effective provocation feels almost reasonable, just enough to activate, not enough to justify withdrawal. A joke framed as humor, a critique framed as concern, a question framed as curiosity. Each delivers a small autonomic spike without triggering full defensive mobilization. The body remains engaged, alert, responsive. This is the sweet spot. Provocation is most effective when the nervous system remains available. At the atmospheric level, this creates a peculiar internal experience. You may notice yourself replaying the moment, running scenarios, imagining responses, preparing explanations that may never be needed. Energy begins to circulate without resolution. The mind thinks it is analyzing. The body knows it is preparing. Preparation without action is metabolically expensive. It keeps the system warm, ready, slightly tense. The longer this state persists, the stronger the urge to discharge it. This is where provocation extracts its value, not through domination, not through coercion, but through self-mobilization. You begin to do the work in the field. In digital environments, this is particularly visible. A comment thread that escalates not because of content, but because of tone. A headline designed to irritate rather than inform. A post that frames moral urgency without offering clarity. The charged pause becomes collective. Thousands of nervous systems lean forward at once. Fingers hover over keyboards. Words form before breath has settled. Reaction spreads faster than reflection. The field hums. Yet provocation is not limited to digital spaces. In relational contexts, it can be even more destabilizing because the stakes feel personal. a partner's withdrawal without explanation, a colleague's ambiguous remark in a meeting, a friend's silence after intimacy. Each introduces a pause that the nervous system interprets as a relational threat. The body moves to restore equilibrium, to repair the connection, to regain footing. But provocation does not seek repair, it seeks exposure. Who will reach out first? Who will over-explain? Who will escalate? Who will retreat? Each response reveals something. This is why provocation often repeats. Once the field learns what activates you, it can refine its strikes. The tone becomes sharper, timing is more precise. The charged pause is shorter or longer depending on effect. Over time, the nervous system may begin to anticipate provocation even in neutral moments. Hypervigilance sets in. Silence feels unsafe. Calm feels temporary. This is not because provocation has become constant. It is because the body has learned that response is required for stability. The charged pause, once introduced repeatedly, rewires expectation. From an MLH perspective, this represents a shift from environmental entrainment to individual targeting. The field no longer needs to saturate the space. It only needs to touch the right nerve, and it does so quietly. Provocation does not shout. It waits. It waits for the moment when your system is already taxed, when clarity is low, when energy is available but ungrounded. Then it introduces just enough charge to tip the balance. In this episode, we are not interested in stopping provocation at the level of behavior. We are interested in recognizing the atmospheric moment when it enters, the moment before reaction, the pause before the reply, the tightening before the explanation. This is where sovereignty lives, not in suppression, not in indifference, but in awareness of sequence. Because when you can feel the charged pause without rushing to resolve it, something remarkable happens. The nervous system completes the arc internally. The urge peaks and passes. The field receives no data. Provocation, deprived of reaction, dissolves, not dramatically, quietly. And in that quiet, internal reference begins to return. But before we move into mechanisms, definitions, and physiology, it is essential to stay here for a moment longer in the atmosphere itself, to recognize provocation not as an event, but as a felt condition, a tension that asks to be resolved, a pause that demands completion, a signal that says, respond now, and to recognize equally clearly that this demand is optional. The charged pause is not a command. It is an invitation, and invitations can be declined, not through resistance, but through presence. When you're ready, we can move into Section 3, Etymology and Definition, to call forth, where we name provocation precisely and begin mapping how this atmospheric charge becomes a tactical operation. Etymology and definition, to call forth, to draw out, to make visible before provocation became a tactic. It was a description of movement. The word provocation traces back to the Latin provocare, to call forth, to summon outward, to challenge into response. Embedded in the root is a directional act. Something inside is invited, pulled, and drawn to the surface. This is the first distinction that matters. Provocation does not insert content. It extracts it. Historically, provocaire was not synonymous with insult or aggression. It described the act of eliciting, of bringing something latent into expression. A response, a reaction, a stance. The provocation itself could be neutral. What mattered was what it revealed. Over time, the word acquired negative connotations because of how it was used. But its core function remained intact, to summon a response that already exists as potential. This is why provocation cannot be reduced to hostility. Hostility pushes. Provocation draws out. And drawing out is a quieter art. In the context of influence, provocation becomes powerful precisely because it operates on what is already primed within the nervous system. It does not need to convince you of anything. It needs to touch what is sensitive. From the perspective of the mirror-linguistic hypothesis, provocation is best understood as a targeted linguistic stimulus that exploits neuro-linguistic mirroring. It introduces a signal calibrated to resonate with pre-existing identity markers, moral commitments, or attachment vulnerabilities, so the nervous system responds reflexively. This response is not an error, it is an update. When a system reacts, it reveals its thresholds, and thresholds are data. This reframes provocation entirely. Rather than asking why did they say that, the more accurate question becomes, what did that signal need to learn? Because provocation is not primarily expressive, it is instrumental. It is deployed to discover what activates you, what destabilizes you, how quickly you respond, and whether you escalate, defend, explain, withdraw, or comply once revealed. These patterns can be anticipated, and anticipation is power. This is why provocation often appears in environments where influence must be refined. Early in a field's life cycle, during propaganda or dogmatism, broad saturation is sufficient. Messages are general, narratives are repeated, coherence is engineered at scale. But once the field has narrowed to the individual, broad strokes become inefficient. Provocation is the scalpel. It replaces saturation with precision. To understand this shift, it's useful to distinguish provocation from its neighboring operations in the descent. Instigation mobilized energy. Deception fractured trust. Provocation tests. It asks, what happens when I touch this nerve? The answer is never verbal. It is physiological. This is why provocation operates below the level of articulated meaning. The signal is often ambiguous by design. Clear statements limit interpretive range. Ambiguity widens it. A comment that can be taken multiple ways forces the nervous system into predictive mode. The brain begins scanning threat or safety, insult or humor, challenge or concern. While the mind debates, the body prepares. This preparation, this leaning forward, is the response provocation seeks. From an MLH field theory perspective, provocation functions as a micropulse within the field, a small high-salience input designed to elicit a disproportionately large autonomic reaction. Unlike propaganda, which relies on repetition, provocation relies on timing. It arrives when energy is already elevated, context is unstable, identity stakes are present, and social consequence is implied. This timing ensures that the response is quick and revealing. The field learns, and once learned, the provocation no longer needs to be repeated in the same form. It can be adjusted, sharpened, or replaced by subtler cues. This is how provocation becomes self-sustaining. After repeated exposure, the nervous system may begin to respond before the provocation is fully delivered. Anticipation replaces stimulus. Hyperreadiness sets in. The field no longer needs to strike. Presence alone is enough. This is where provocation becomes difficult to name. To the outside observer, nothing appears overtly wrong. There is no shouting, no explicit insult, no clear boundary violation. Yet the body feels under pressure, alert, ready, slightly tense. This discrepancy often leads to self-doubt. Am I overreacting? Did I imagine that? Why do I feel like I need to respond? These questions are not signs of irrationality. They are evidence that provocation has succeeded in externalizing reference. The nervous system is responding accurately, but the cognitive frame to explain it has not yet formed. This gap between sensation and explanation is fertile ground for further influence. Provocation thrives here because it leaves no clear object to confront. What would you point to? A tone, a look, a pause. Each is deniable. Each can be reframed. Each places the burden of proof back onto the person reacting. This is why provocation is often paired with humor, irony, or moral framing. These provide plausible cover while maintaining charge. I was just joking. I'm only asking a question. I didn't mean it like that. Each response neutralizes the content while preserving the effect. From a field perspective, this is elegant. The signal has already done its work. The reaction has been harvested. The follow-up does not need to escalate. It only needs to maintain ambiguity. At this point, it becomes clear why provocation cannot be understood purely psychologically. It is not merely about intention or personality. It is about signal dynamics. Provocation is an interaction between a stimulus, a nervous system, and a field that rewards reaction. Remove any one of these, and provocation loses potency. But in modern environments, digital, organizational, and relational, these conditions are frequently aligned. Platforms reward engagement, workplaces reward responsiveness, relationships reward emotional availability. Provocation slips easily into these reward structures because it produces movement, and movement is visible, silence is not. This creates a powerful asymmetry. Those who react are legible, those who pause are opaque. Provocation exploits this asymmetry by framing reaction as participation and silence as loss. From an MLH standpoint, this framing is itself a linguistic operation. Words like engagement, accountability, responsiveness, speaking up carry moral weight. They encourage action without examining sequence. The nervous system hears, move now or be excluded. This is not coercion, it is summoning. Provocation calls you forward, and once you step forward, the field adjusts. This is why provocation often feels personal even when it is systemic. The stimulus may originate from a structure, an algorithm, a policy, a cultural norm, but the extraction happens at the level of the individual body. Your charge, your breath, your words, all become data points. The definition of provocation, then, must reflect this function. Within the resonance matrix, provocation can be defined as a targeted linguistic or tonal stimulus designed to elicit a predictable autonomic response, thereby extracting emotional and behavioral data that can be used to refine influence. This definition deliberately avoids moral language. Provocation is not inherently malicious. It is a tool. Like any tool, its impact depends on context, repetition, and asymmetry of power, but its effects are real. Repeated provocation trains the nervous system to remain in a state of readiness. Over time, this erodes baseline regulation. The body becomes faster to react, slower to settle. Reflection shortens. The ineffable gap narrows. Eventually, reaction begins to feel like identity. That's just how I am. I don't let things slide. I have to respond. These statements often conceal a deeper truth. The nervous system has been conditioned to believe that non-response equals danger. This conditioning is not reversed through insight alone. It is reversed through sequence restoration, allowing sensation to complete without immediate action. But before we move into physiology and practice, it is essential to understand provocation for what it is. Not an insult, not a challenge, not a conflict, but a call to step forward, a call to reveal, a call to react, and like any call, it can be answered or not. The difference lies not in strength, but in timing. When the nervous system learns that it does not need to respond immediately to remain safe, provocation loses its leverage. The signal still arrives, the body still feels it, but the field receives nothing in return. This is the quiet shift that marks the end of automatic participation in the reaction economy. It is from here, now that provocation has been named, not as behavior but as operation, that we can move into its biological mechanics, how the strike lands, what it triggers, why it feels instantaneous, and how the body, once aware, begins to reclaim its own tempo. The cognitive hook reaction as evidence provocation does not need to convince you, it needs you to move. The cognitive hook of provocation is not argument, persuasion, or belief change. It is far more economical. It converts reaction into proof, proof that the stimulus landed, proof that the signal mattered, proof that the field now knows where to touch next. This is the moment where influence stops speaking to you and starts listening through you, from the standpoint of the mirror linguistic hypothesis. This hook exploits a basic feature of predictive cognition. The brain is constantly updating its internal models based on error correction. When something unexpected occurs, a sharp tone, an ambiguous jab, a loaded pause, prediction fails. The system registers surprise, and surprise demands resolution. The fastest resolution is action. Reaction collapses uncertainty by doing something, replying, defending, correcting, explaining, withdrawing. The brain treats this as adaptive. Uncertainty decreases. The loop closes. But something else happens at the same time. The field learns. Every reaction contains information about what you value, what you protect, what destabilizes you, how quickly you mobilize, which identities feel most threatened. None of this requires your conscious consent. Reaction is data because reaction is unfiltered. It precedes narrative editing. It arrives before social performance can smooth it out. In that sense, provocation does not merely provoke emotion, it bypasses self-presentation. This is why provocation is so often framed as just a question or just a comment. Overt aggression invites preparation. Subtle provocation invites authenticity. The system wants your first response, not your considered one. This is the cognitive hook. The nervous system believes it is protecting coherence, while the field is extracting signals. In practical terms, provocation works by triggering what psychologists sometimes describe as ego salience, the rapid prioritization of self-related information. Anything that threatens identity, status, belonging, competence, or moral standing immediately jumps the queue. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for reflection, context, and inhibition, is not offline, but it is delayed. It arrives second. By the time it weighs in, the reaction has already occurred. This delay is not accidental. Provocation targets the temporal gap between sensation and cognition. The shorter the gap, the cleaner the data. From an MLH field theory perspective, this gap is the ineffable gap, the neurological space where sovereignty resides. Provocation aims to collapse it, not through force, but through urgency. Urgency is not loud. Urgency is time pressure framed as relevance. The message is implicit: respond now or lose something. What might be lost is rarely specified. That vagueness is part of the hook. The nervous system fills in the blanks using past experience. The more unresolved threat history a person carries, the faster the fill. This is why provocation is often uneven in its effects. One person shrugs it off, another feels compelled to respond. The difference is not strength or intelligence. It is history. Provocation does not create sensitivity. It locates it. Once located, it becomes reliable. This reliability is what makes provocation valuable to systems of influence. Reaction patterns are predictable. Predictability allows calibration. Calibration allows control. At this point, it's important to distinguish between meaning and function. The meaning of a provocative statement may be trivial, absurd, or easily dismissed, but its function is complete the moment it elicits a response. This is why arguing content rarely neutralizes provocation. Content is not the target. The target is response latency and intensity. How fast did you reply? How emotionally charged was it? Did you escalate? Did you explain? Did you withdraw? Each answer updates the field's internal model. From a cognitive standpoint, this creates a subtle reversal of agency. You believe you are responding to the stimulus. In reality, the stimulus is learning from you. This reversal is often invisible because the reaction feels self-generated. The body moves, words appear, and it feels like choice. But choice without pause is reflex, and the reflex is legible. This is why provocation thrives in environments that reward immediacy. Digital platforms, for example, compress response windows. Notifications, comment threads, and public visibility all incentivize speed. The faster you respond, the more visible you are. Visibility becomes validation, and validation reinforces reaction. This feedback loop trains the nervous system to associate quick response with safety and belonging. Over time, the absence of reaction begins to feel like a risk. This is the deeper cognitive trap. Provocation does not just extract data, it reprograms expectation. The system learns to anticipate stimuli and prepare responses in advance. Muscles tense earlier. Attention narrows faster. The body begins living slightly ahead of the present moment. This anticipatory state is metabolically expensive. It keeps the nervous system in low-grade mobilization, but it also feels necessary. The mind justifies it as vigilance, awareness, or responsibility. In reality, it is preemptive compliance. From the MLH perspective, this is neuro-linguistic mirroring at work. Repeated exposure to provocative signals updates the brain's predictive models. The system learns that certain tones, topics, or pauses precede threat. The mirror adjusts. Readiness increases. Eventually, provocation no longer needs to be delivered externally. The body does it internally. You replay conversations. You imagine responses. You rehearse explanations. The field has been internalized. This is where provocation becomes particularly destabilizing because it no longer feels like something happening to you. feels like who you are. I'm just reactive. I don't let things slide. I have strong opinions. These identities often mask a nervous system that has learned to treat stillness as unsafe. The cognitive hook tightens here because reaction becomes self-affirming. Responding feels like integrity. Silence feels like a betrayal of self. This moralization of reaction is one of provocation's most effective disguises. It reframes impulse as principle. From a cognitive standpoint, this reframing short-circuits reflection. If reaction equals integrity, then pausing equals cowardice. The nervous system no longer needs external pressure. It polices itself. This is not indoctrination. It is entrainment, and it is reversible, but not through argument. Understanding provocation cognitively does not require condemning reaction. Reaction is natural. It is adaptive. It evolved to protect. The work here is not to eliminate reaction, but to decouple it from authority. Reaction can occur without being obeyed. This distinction restores the ineffable gap. The moment you notice the urge to respond without immediately acting on it, the cognitive hook loosens. The brain registers a new prediction. I can feel this and remain safe. This update is subtle but powerful. It teaches the nervous system that urgency is not synonymous with danger. That time can stretch without loss. That silence does not equal disappearance. From the field's perspective, this is a problem. No reaction means no data. No data means no refinement. Provocation without extraction collapses into noise. This is why the most effective counter to provocation is not rebuttal, but non-instrumental presence. Staying with sensation long enough for cognition to re-enter, allowing interpretation to arrive after activation subsides. This is not passivity, it is temporal agency, and temporal agency is what provocation seeks to steal. In closing this section, it's worth returning to a simple truth. Provocation does not prove anything about you. It only reveals what the nervous system has learned to protect. Once that protection no longer requires immediate action, reaction stops being evidence and becomes information again. Information you can hold, information you can observe, information you can choose not to spend, and with that choice restored, the reaction economy begins to lose its grip. The somatic blueprint, the strike that spikes provocation, does not announce itself in language first. It arrives as a sensation. Before the mind registers meaning, before words are formed, the body has already moved. Not dramatically, often imperceptibly. A shift in muscle tone, a catch in the breath, a tightening behind the eyes, a subtle forward lean of attention. This is the somatic blueprint of provocation. It is not psychological, it is physiological, and it unfolds in a predictable sequence. Understanding this sequence matters, because once the body's response is seen clearly, provocation loses much of its mystique. What once felt personal, confusing, or destabilizing begins to reveal itself as a biological reflex exploited by timing and signal. 1. The initial salient spike. Something matters. The first somatic event in provocation is not emotion. It is salience detection. The brain salience network, primarily involving the amygdala, anterior insular, and anterior cingulate cortex, flags a stimulus as important. Not good, not bad, just relevant. This can be triggered by tone shifts, unexpected pauses, ambiguous language, moral implication, and social threat cues. The stimulus does not need to be hostile. It only needs to be unexpected or unfinished. At the bodily level, this appears as microtension in the chest or throat, a slight narrowing of focus, an orienting reflex toward the source, and a momentary pause in spontaneous movement. This is the body saying, pay attention. From an MLH perspective, this is the first mirroring event. The nervous system begins to align with the frequency of the signal. The field has made contact. 2. Autonomic shift. Sympathetic mobilization. Within milliseconds, the autonomic nervous system begins to shift. The sympathetic branch activates, not into full fight or flight, but into readiness. This is crucial. Provocation is not designed to overwhelm. It is designed to mobilize without resolution. Common somatic markers at this stage include increased heart rate variability skewed toward acceleration, shallow or suspended breath, jaw tightening, heat in the face, neck or upper chest, and slight trembling or internal vibration. The body is preparing to act, but it has not yet been given a clear action. This incomplete mobilization creates tension. Tension is not discomfort for its own sake. It is stored energy awaiting discharge. This is where provocation becomes effective. The nervous system does not like unresolved mobilization. It seeks completion. Completion can come through speaking, defending, explaining, correcting, withdrawing, and escalating. Any of these will do. The field does not care how the energy is discharged, only that it is. 3. Prefrontal delay. The narrowing of choice as sympathetic activation increases, blood flow and neural priority shift away from the prefrontal cortex towards subcortical systems designed for rapid response. This does not mean thinking stops. It means thinking narrows. Cognition becomes instrumental rather than reflective. The mind begins searching for justification, defense, resolution, and restoration of status or safety. This is why responses under provocation often feel compelled rather than chosen. The body is leading. The mind is justifying. From the inside, this can feel like, I need to say something. I can't let that go. If I don't respond, something bad will happen. These are not beliefs. They are somatic imperatives translated into language. This translation happens so quickly that it feels seamless. But the sequence matters. Sensation to mobilization and mobilization to cognition, not the other way around. 4. The urge to complete reaction as regulation. At this point, the nervous system is seeking regulation. Provocation works because it offers a false promise. React and you will feel better, and often, you do briefly. Responding discharges energy. Muscles relax. Breath deepens. Heart rate settles. The nervous system interprets this as success. What it does not see is that the relief came not from safety, but from completion of activation. This creates a powerful learning loop. The body learns, when I feel this spike, action resolves it. This learning is non-verbal and non-conscious. It is encoded in the autonomic nervous system. Over time, this conditioning makes reaction feel necessary. Stillness begins to feel unsafe, not because it is, but because the body has not learned how to let mobilization settle internally. This is where provocation becomes addictive, not psychologically, physiologically. 5. The cost of repetition, chronic mobilization, repeated exposure to provocation without resolution at the level of meaning creates a chronic state of partial activation. The nervous system remains slightly on. Signs of this include persistent vigilance, irritability without clear cause, difficulty resting, replaying interactions mentally, and a sense of always being on call. This state is often misinterpreted as anxiety, personality, or temperament. In reality, it is entrained readiness. The body has learned that the environment is unpredictable and that rapid response is required for safety or belonging. This is particularly damaging in relational contexts, where provocation is intermittent and ambiguous. The nervous system never knows when the next spike will arrive, so it stays primed. This is not resilience. It is fatigue masquerading as strength. 6. The freeze-fawn drift, when mobilization has no exit, when provocation is repeated but reaction no longer restores safety because the field escalates, denies, or shifts, the nervous system may begin to shut down mobilization. This is where sympathetic activation gives way to dorsal vagal responses: numbness, withdrawal, dissociation, collapse, and loss of voice. Alternatively, the system may move into fawn, appeasement, over-explaining, self-blame, and compliance. Both are attempts to regulate overwhelming uncertainty. Neither reflects weakness. Both reflect adaptation. Provocation, when combined with deception or gaslighting, often pushes systems into these states. The body stops trying to win. It tries to survive. 7. Why the body knows before the mind. One of the most destabilizing aspects of provocation is that the body often reacts before the mind can explain why. This gap leads to self-doubt. I feel something, but I can't explain it. Maybe I'm overreacting. Nothing really happened. This internal conflict arises because the somatic system is detecting pattern, not event. The body is exquisitely sensitive to tone consistency, relational timing, energetic presence, and withdrawal patterns. These cues often do not register cognitively until much later, if at all. This does not make them imaginary. It makes them preverbal. MLH places particular importance here. Language is not just what is said. It is how presence is modulated. Tone, pacing, silence, and implication all carry somatic weight. The body receives these signals instantly. The mind tries to catch up. 8. Reclaiming the somatic sequence. Understanding the somatic blueprint of provocation is not about control. It is about permission. Permission to feel activation without obeying it. Permission to notice readiness without discharging it immediately. Permission to let the body complete its own arc when mobilization is allowed to rise and fall internally without external action. The nervous system learns something new. I can survive this sensation without reacting. This learning is the foundation of sovereignty, not mastery, not dominance. But self-trust, and self-trust is incompatible with extraction. Provocation loses its leverage when the body no longer needs reaction to feel safe. The strike still lands, the spike still occurs, but it passes, and in that passing, the field receives nothing. No data, no pattern, no leverage. This is not resistance. It is non-cooperation at the biological level, and it begins not in thought, but in sensation. Field case study. The emotional harvest provocation is where the field stops speaking at scale and starts testing you. Up to this point in Volume 2, we've tracked operations that shape atmosphere, propaganda, harden internal ground, dogmatism, mobilize energy, instigation, and fracture perceptual trust, deception. Now the descent tightens. The stimulus becomes smaller, sharper, and more personal. Provocation is not primarily about winning arguments. It is about eliciting a measurable autonomic event, a sympathetic spike, a compulsive reply, a defensive explanation, a public escalation, a private rumination, and then using that output as signal intelligence. In neurolinguistic hypothesis field theory, MLHF terms, provocation is an acoustic strike calibrated to collapse the ineffable gap and harvest a response before self-editing returns. That response is the payload. The words are often just the delivery mechanism. This section grounds the operation in real-world fields, digital, organizational, relational, and then moves into documented legal and political examples where provocation-like tactics, often framed legally as incitement or harassment, were treated as criminally consequential. Not to sensationalize, to demonstrate a sober truth. When you understand provocation as a field operation, you stop asking why would someone do that and start asking what does the field gain from my mobilization. The digital field rage bait as reconnaissance. Digital platforms reward reaction because reaction is legible. It produces clicks, comments, quote tweets, stitches, duets, replies, reposts. In attention economies, your nervous system becomes a revenue stream. Provocation online tends to be engineered around 3 levers. 1. Status threat. A post implies you're ignorant, immoral, gullible, or weak, then waits for you to prove otherwise. 2. Moral compression. A statement forces binary alignment. If you don't respond, you're complicit. It collapses nuance and time. 3. Identity hooks. It targets group loyalty, politics, culture, religion, class, gender, nation, health, ideology, anything that converts disagreement into existential threat. This is why so much provocation online is structured as just asking questions or just a meme or just satire. The field doesn't need you to believe it. It needs you to move. Once you react, the field learns which words spike you, how fast you respond, whether you escalate or explain, whether you seek consensus or dominance, whether you shame others or self-correct, whether you collapse into rumination afterwards. That becomes your behavioral fingerprint. Researchers and commentators have long flagged how engagement-driven environments systematically advantage high arousal content, outrage, indignation, fear, because it keeps attention glued. Case pattern digital. The comment that isn't meant to be answered. A thread begins with something slightly insulting but plausibly deniable. You reply carefully. The next response ignores your content and questions your character. You reply again, adding nuance. A third response mocks the nuance. The field isn't refining truth. It's mapping your thresholds and encouraging you to spend energy proving your legitimacy. The provocation is successful if it achieves any of these outcomes. You keep engaging past the point of value. You abandon internal reference and start performing. You become increasingly dysregulated. You become more extreme to match the tone, and you bring others into the conflict, amplifying the field. The emotional harvest is not the argument. It is the mobilization. The workplace field provocation, disguised as culture workplaces, often claim neutrality, while structurally rewarding reaction. In organizational fields, provocation tends to be quieter than online because reputational consequences matter. It often arrives through just joking remarks that undermine competence, ambiguous feedback that keeps you slightly off balance, shifting standards so you're always catching up, moralist language, professionalism, team fit, tone used to gatekeep legitimacy, and meetings where your point is ignored until repeated by someone else. Here, provocation functions as status testing. It asks, will you self-advocate? Will you over-explain? Will you go silent? Will you explode? Each reaction updates a social model of you. If you react strongly, you can be framed as difficult. If you react softly, you can be ignored. If you don't react, you can be walked over. The trap is not the comment, it's the position you're forced into. Case pattern, workplace, the baited correction. A colleague states something subtly inaccurate about your work in a group setting. You correct it. They respond. No need to be defensive. The field just harvested a clean sample of your self-protection reflex. If you correct again, you become argumentative. If you stop correcting, your reputation quietly degrades. This is why provocation in systems often pairs with deception. The facts are made slightly slippery. Then your reaction to slipperiness becomes the problem. This is also why you can have a workplace that publicly promotes well-being while privately running an extractive emotional economy, where mental health becomes branding rather than structural reality. That hypocrisy is one of the clearest field tells. Image coherence without embodied coherence. The relational field provocation as intimacy control. In relationships and friendships, provocation is rarely overt. If it were overt, you'd name it quickly. Instead, it often arrives as passive-aggressive phrasing, strategic withdrawal, presence without attunement, affection followed by coldness, your overthinking as a reflex dismissal, jokes with a sting, then denial of intent. Here, provocation does something particularly destabilizing. It makes the nervous system believe it must earn stability by responding correctly. The field becomes warmth to small jab to ambiguity and your anxiety, your repair attempt to brief relief and to repeat. That loop is not always conscious, but it is extremely effective at extracting emotional labor. Because the cues are subtle, outsiders can't easily validate them. The harm becomes private and undeniable. This is why psychological physiological abuse is so effective. It weaponizes the fact that somatic truth is hard to prove socially. When provocation crosses into criminality, from reaction to incitement and harassment now, widen the lens. Not every provocation is criminal. Most isn't. Much of it sits inside the gray zones of culture, incentives, and deniability. But history shows that provocation can become structurally recognizable in legal terms when it crosses into direct and public incitement to violence, orchestrated harassment campaigns, deliberate destabilization that contributes to foreseeable harm. Two of the clearest internationally documented examples sit in the realm of mass communication and collective violence, where provocation isn't merely interpersonal but societal. The ICT case Rwanda. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda prosecuted media leaders associated with RTLM radio and Kangura newspaper. The case is widely referred to as the media case. The tribunal convicted individuals for crimes, including direct and public incitement, to commit genocide and related offences. Whatever one's broader political interpretation of events, the legal core is stark. Speech, acts, and broadcast patterns were treated as operational components of harm, not merely opinion. The appeals chamber's work also sharpened distinctions between protected speech and incitement standards. From a neurolinguistic hypothesis field theory, MLHFT lens, this illustrates something uncomfortable but clarifying. A coherent media field can entrain bodies at scale, and repeated calls to action can convert mobilization into collective movement. That's provocation's macro form. The strike is distributed, the nervous systems are synchronized, and reaction becomes mass behavior. V. Julius Streicher at Nuremberg. Julius Streicher, publisher of the violently anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, was convicted at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity based on his role in inciting hatred and violence. Again, regardless of the broader historical context, the legal principle matters. Persuasive messaging, repeated over time, can be treated as materially contributing to persecution and violence when it functions as incitement and dehumanization. From a resonance matrix perspective, this is the dark end state of field coherence, where language doesn't merely describe reality, but rebuilds the nervous system's moral frame so that cruelty feels like duty. These are extreme examples, but they clarify the spectrum. They show provocation is not only a personal dynamic. In coherent fields, it can become societal engineering. See contemporary political provocation for modern politics. It's easy to get partisan fast, which isn't the point of this project. So the cleanest grounded claim we can make is structural. Outrage and high arousal framing drive attention and engagement in modern media ecosystems. Data-driven targeting has been used to shape political messaging, raising concerns about emotional manipulation and micro-targeted influence. Cambridge Analytica is a well-known example of this broader shift in political communication and digital profiling debates. Notice the shared mechanism, not lies versus truth, but salience control. The field learns what activates segments, then serves stimuli calibrated to extract reaction, clicks, shares, anger, fear, tribal loyalty, whether or not a particular campaign worked. The tactical model is clear. Provocation becomes a tool for engagement and polarization because engagement is measurable. This is the reaction economy scaled into politics. The field case study, the harvest in 4 moves to make the operation visible without inventing villains. Here is an example scenario that can occur in any modern field, digital, relational, organizational. Move 1. The signal is planted. A remark is made that is ambiguous but status threatening. I'm surprised you'd say that. It contains no explicit accusation, but it calls forth the need to justify. Somatic receipt, charge, breath catch, and an urge to explain. Move 2. The response is harvested. You respond carefully, trying to clarify. The other party ignores your clarity and focuses on your tone. You're getting defensive. Somatic receipt, jaw tension, accelerating speech, narrowing focus. Move 3. The field reframes your reaction as the problem. Now the content no longer matters. Your nervous system becomes the evidence. See? This is what I mean. Somatic receipt, rumination begins, self-doubt, compulsion to repair. Move 4, relief is offered, then withdrawn. A brief warmth appears, let's not argue. Then distance returns. Your system learns, stability requires compliance. That is the harvest. Your attention, your energy, your self-reference, converted into leverage. Why this section matters. If you've ever thought, I can't prove it, but I know what I felt. They were present, but something felt wrong. I kept reacting and didn't know why. This is why. Provocation is a state-shaping operation. It recruits the body, then uses the body's mobilization as evidence and fuel. The point of seeing it is not to become paranoid or hypervigilant. It is to restore the right order. Sensation leads to awareness, and awareness leads to meaning and choice. When that order holds, provocation loses its ability to farm your nervous system for data. The data extraction loop, why provocation repeats provocation, rarely appears once. If it did, it would be easy to dismiss. What makes provocation effective and destabilizing is not the initial strike, but the loop that follows. A loop that learns, a loop that refines, a loop that quietly turns your nervous system into a feedback device. This is where provocation shifts from event to process. Once a reaction has been elicited, the field does not simply move on. It stores what it learned. The next stimulus is adjusted. The timing tightens. The tone shifts slightly. The ambiguity increases or decreases depending on what produced the clearest response. From the standpoint of mirror-linguistic field theory, this is predictive locking. The field is no longer guessing. It is calibrating. Reaction as training signal. Every time you respond under provocation, you teach the field something about you, not intellectually, physiologically. The field learns how fast your system mobilizes, which identities carry the most charge, whether you escalate or appease, how long it takes you to settle afterward, and whether relief follows reaction or resistance. This learning does not require intention on either side. It emerges from repetition, and repetition is powerful. In biological systems, repetition creates expectation. Expectation shapes readiness. Readiness shortens response time. Over time, reaction becomes anticipatory. This is the beginning of entrainment. The nervous system starts preparing before the stimulus fully arrives. The charged pause becomes enough. A familiar tone is sufficient. Even a context associated with previous provocation can trigger mobilization. The field no longer needs to strike. Presence alone activates the loop. 2. The compression of the ineffable gap with each iteration. The ineffable gap, the space between sensation and response, narrows. At first, you might feel the urge and still pause. Later, the pause shortens. Eventually, the response feels instantaneous. This is not a loss of willpower. It is a loss of time, and time is sovereignty. Provocation repeats because it is rewarded by speed. The faster the response, the cleaner the data. The cleaner the data, the more precise the next strike. This precision is what makes later provocations feel uncanny. as if they know exactly where to touch. They do. You taught them. 3. From extraction to self-extraction. At a certain point, provocation no longer requires an external stimulus. The loop internalizes. You begin to rehearse responses mentally, preemptively defend positions, scan for tone shifts and brace for remarks that haven't been made. The nervous system, once trained, becomes self-stimulating. This is not rumination as pathology. It is entrainment as memory. The field has been mirrored into your internal environment. From here, provocation becomes especially difficult to name because it appears to come from within. The original stimulus may be gone, but the readiness remains. This is why people often say, I'm out of the situation, but I can't move past it. The loop is still running. Why the loop is so stable. The data extraction loop persists for 3 reasons. First, reaction often brings short-term relief. Discharging activation through response temporarily regulates the nervous system. The body learns that reaction works. Second, the field reinforces reaction. Online, you get visibility. At work, you're seen as engaged. In relationships, tension briefly resolves. These reinforcements strengthen the loop. Third, silence is punished subtly. Non-response may be framed as weakness, guilt, disinterest, or disengagement. The field makes inaction costly. Together, these forces stabilize the loop. Reaction becomes the safest option in the moment, even as it erodes long-term regulation. The escalation curve. Once the loop is established, provocation often escalates, not in volume, but in efficiency. Early provocations may be clumsy or obvious. Later ones become minimal, a look, a phrase, a timing shift, and a strategic silence. The field no longer needs to provoke strongly because it has learned your nervous system's thresholds. This escalation curve explains why later stages of influence can feel worse even though nothing overtly dramatic is happening. The system is operating with less stimulus and more effect. That is the hallmark of refinement. Breaking the loop without force. The loop does not break through confrontation. Confrontation often feeds it. It breaks when the nervous system learns a new association. Activation does not require immediate discharge. This learning is somatic, not conceptual. When you feel the spike and allow it to rise and fall without reaction, the field receives no data, no update occurs. The predictive model fails. From the field's perspective, this is noise. Repeated failures weaken the loop. Over time, the charged pause loses its pull. The system stops preparing in advance. Readiness relaxes, not because the world is safe, but because your body has reclaimed timing. A subtle but critical reframe. The goal is not to stop reacting forever. Reaction is human. The goal is to remove reaction from the economy of extraction. When your response is chosen rather than compelled, when it arrives after sensation and awareness, the field can no longer use it as raw data. It becomes opaque again, and opacity is a form of protection that does not require armor. Why naming the loop matters. Seeing the data extraction loop for what it is restores dignity. It reframes past reactions not as weakness or failure, but as predictable biological responses inside an engineered environment. This removes shame, and shame is one of the field's most reliable accelerants. When shame dissolves, the loop loses another source of fuel. The sovereign shield, exiting the reaction economy without armoring sovereignty, does not arrive as strength. It arrives as timing. Not the timing of a perfect response, or the timing of a clever retort, but the timing that restores sequence inside the nervous system, where sensation is allowed to complete before meaning is assigned, and meaning is allowed to settle before action is chosen. After provocation, this sequence is often disrupted. The body has learned that speed equals safety, that reaction equals presence, that silence equals loss. Over time, the nervous system begins to confuse non-response with abandonment, erasure, or danger. The sovereign shield exists to unwind that confusion, not by force, not by suppression, but by re-establishing internal reference. Sovereignty is not resistance. One of the most common misunderstandings about sovereignty is that it requires opposition. That to be sovereign, you must stand firm, push back, assert boundaries loudly, or confront influence head-on. This misunderstanding is itself a product of provocation. Provocation frames power as something exercised through reaction. It invites you into a duel of intensity. Even resistance can become fuel if it remains reactive. Sovereignty is not resistance. It is a non-instrumental presence. When presence is restored, the field loses its leverage automatically, not because you fought it, but because it could no longer use you. The sovereign shield does not block signals. It receives them without obedience. This distinction matters deeply. Blocking requires effort. Receiving without reaction restores rest. The restoration of internal reference. Provocation externalizes reference. It teaches the nervous system to look outward for cues of safety, legitimacy, and timing. You learn to track tone shifts, pauses, reactions, and microsignals in others more closely than your own internal state. Over time, this creates a subtle dislocation. You may notice difficulty knowing what you actually feel, over-reliance on external feedback, a sense of being on stage, even in private, and exhaustion without a clear cause. This is not because you lost yourself. It is because your reference point was exported. The sovereign shield restores reference by reversing this flow. Instead of, what does this mean for me? The orientation becomes, what is happening in me right now? This question is not analytical. It is somatic. It does not require explanation. It requires attention, and attention, when directed inward without urgency, begins to reorganize the nervous system. Expanding the ineffable gap at the heart of the sovereign shield is the ineffable gap, the space between stimulus and response where choice exists. Provocation collapses this gap by accelerating sequence. The body moves, the mind justifies, and action occurs before awareness can intervene. The shield does not attempt to hold back reaction. That would be another form of control. Instead, it widens the gap by slowing perception. Slowing perception does not mean becoming dull or disengaged. It means allowing sensation to fully register before translating it into narrative. For example, noticing heat without naming it anger, noticing tension without assigning blame, noticing readiness without choosing action. This pause is not passive, it is neurological sovereignty. Each time the nervous system experiences activation without immediate discharge, it learns a new association. I can feel this and remain intact. This learning rewires expectations. Over time, the gap widens naturally. Reaction no longer feels mandatory. Choice reappears. Why silence is so powerful and so difficult. Silence is often misinterpreted as avoidance. But in the context of provocation, silence can be the most regulated response available. Not performative silence, not punitive silence, but somatic silence, the absence of reaction while presence remains. Provocation depends on completion. It creates tension that seeks resolution. When no resolution is offered, the field receives no confirmation. Silence interrupts the data loop. However, silence is difficult because it initially increases internal sensation. The energy that would have been discharged through reaction stays in the body. This can feel uncomfortable, even threatening, especially for systems conditioned by abandonment or relational unpredictability. This discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that the nervous system is learning to self-regulate. The sovereign shield does not demand silence as a rule. It allows silence as an option, and options are the foundation of autonomy. The difference between withdrawal and sovereignty. It's important to distinguish sovereignty from withdrawal. Withdrawal collapses presence. Sovereignty maintains it. Withdrawal says, I can't be here. Sovereignty says, I'm here and I don't need to move. This distinction is subtle but crucial. In withdrawal, the nervous system often enters dorsal states, numbness, shutdown, dissociation. In sovereignty, the system remains ventral, engaged, aware, but not reactive. The body feels grounded rather than frozen. This is why the sovereign shield is not about disengaging from the world. It is about changing the quality of engagement. Sovereignty as temporal authority. Provocation steals time. It compresses decision-making windows. It creates false urgency. It frames delay as danger. The sovereign shield restores temporal authority. You decide when to respond, if to respond, how to respond, not because you are withholding, but because time has been returned to you. This restoration often feels anticlimactic. There is no surge, no victory, no dramatic shift, just a quiet sense of, I don't need to do anything right now. This is deeply unsettling to systems built on extraction and deeply regulating to the nervous system. Relearning completion without action. One of the most powerful elements of the sovereign shield is teaching the body that completion does not require external action. Activation has a natural arc, rise, peak, and fall. Provocation interrupts this arc by offering action as the only exit. The shield allows the arc to complete internally. This may look like staying with sensation until it softens, letting breath deepen on its own, and noticing muscles relax without command. These are not techniques. They are permissions. Permission for the body to finish what it started. When this happens repeatedly, the nervous system recalibrates. It learns, I don't need reaction to feel whole. Once that learning takes hold, provocation loses its power at the biological level. The end of the reaction economy thrives on visibility. It rewards quick replies, emotional displays, public alignment, and moral signaling. The sovereign shield exits this economy by becoming opaque. Opacity does not mean secrecy. It means unavailability for extraction. When your nervous system is no longer compelled to perform, the field cannot monetize your response. This is not disengagement from life. It is engagement on your terms. Reclaiming dignity. One of the quiet harms of provocation is the erosion of dignity. Repeated reaction can leave you feeling exposed, raw, or ashamed, as though your inner life has been made public without consent. The sovereign shield restores dignity by restoring privacy of sensation. Your feelings become yours again. Your responses become chosen. Your timing becomes sovereign. This dignity does not need to be asserted. It is felt. A final orientation. The sovereign shield is not something you apply. It is something that emerges when the nervous system realizes it no longer needs to be fast to be safe. You will still feel provoked. You will still notice a charge. You will still recognize the invitation. But you will also recognize that it is optional. That recognition is the shield, not armor, not hardness, not withdrawal, but grounded presence that cannot be harvested. And when presence cannot be harvested, influence loses its leverage, quietly, naturally, without force. Observation practice. The unsent response. At this point in the episode, you may notice something unexpected. Not clarity in the usual sense, not answers, but a softening of urgency. This is intentional. Provocation trains the nervous system to believe that something must be done, that every signal requires response, that stillness equals loss. The observation practice offered here does not aim to correct that belief directly. It simply creates a condition where the belief can dissolve on its own. This practice is not an exercise. It is a permission Over the next few days, not as a task, not as a discipline, you may begin to notice moments when a response feels imminent. A message arrives, a comment is made, a look lingers, the silence stretches, the familiar spike appears, charge, tightness, the urge to reply. In those moments, nothing is required. No restraint, no analysis, no confrontation, only noticing. Notice, when the body prepares before the mind decides, when words assemble themselves without invitation, when explanation feels compulsory, when silence feels intolerable. Notice how quickly identity enters. Notice how fast time compresses. Notice how urgency frames itself as responsibility. Then, and this is important, notice what happens if you do nothing for a few seconds longer than usual. Not forever, not as a rule. Just prolong the moment for pause. What does the sensation do? Does it intensify? Does it plateau? Does it soften? Most people discover something surprising here. The sensation changes. It does not require action to move. It does not require words to resolve. It completes itself. This completion is the nervous system teaching itself a new lesson. I can feel this without spending myself. There is no right outcome, no preferred duration, no performance. Some moments will pass easily. Others will feel charged and uncomfortable. Both are valid. The observation practice is not about winning against provocation. It is about withdrawing your nervous system from the reaction economy, one moment at a time. When a response remains unsent, whether that response is verbal, written, or behavioral, something subtle shifts. The field receives no data. The loop fails to update. The pattern weakens and, importantly, you remain intact. Self-reflection prompt, where reaction became safety. Only one question is offered here, not to answer, not to journal, not to resolve, just to let it echo. What part of me learned that reacting quickly was necessary to stay safe or connected? This question is not an accusation. It does not assume weakness. It does not assume pathology. It does not assume fault. It assumes adaptation. Most reaction patterns were learned in environments where unpredictability was high, silence was punished, emotional attunement was inconsistent, authority was volatile, and care was conditional. In such environments, speed is protective. Response becomes a way to remain visible, to prevent loss, to stabilize the connection. Provocation exploits these learned strategies, not because they are flawed, but because they are reliable. This reflection is not about changing the past. It is about recognizing that what once kept you safe may no longer be required, and that recognition alone begins to loosen the grip. No answers are needed. The nervous system does not need conclusions to recalibrate. It needs permission to update. Integration from reaction to reference. Integration is not something you do. It is something that occurs when understanding and sensation align. At this stage in the episode, the nervous system has likely recognized itself in the patterns described, perhaps gently, perhaps uncomfortably, perhaps with relief. Integration does not demand that you become non-reactive. It does not demand calm. It does not demand strength. It asks for sequence. Sensation first, awareness second, meaning third, action, if any, last. Provocation reverses this order. It demands action first, then justification. Integration restores the natural flow. This restoration often feels quieter than expected. There is no dramatic aha, no sense of triumph, just a subtle reorientation. I don't have to move yet. That sentence is not passive, it is sovereign. As this orientation settles, you may notice changes that are difficult to describe, but easy to feel. Conversations feel less gripping. Silence feels less threatening. Urgency loses its moral charge. You stop rehearsing explanations in advance, and your body settles more quickly after stimulation. These are not achievements. They are byproducts of restored internal reference. Importantly, this does not mean you disengage from the world. You may still speak, still respond, still act. But when you do, it is no longer because your nervous system was summoned. It is because you chose to. Choice restores dignity. Dignity restores coherence, and coherence cannot be harvested. Provocation myth debunked. If I don't respond, I lose power. One of the deepest myths provocation relies on is this: if I don't respond, I lose. Lose status, lose ground, lose credibility, lose connection. This belief is understandable. In many systems, reaction is rewarded and silence is framed as weakness. But the truth is more nuanced. Reaction gives information. Information gives leverage. Silence, when it is grounded, not collapsed, gives neither. Power in provocation does not come from speaking louder or faster. It comes from temporal control. Who decides when the interaction moves forward? Who sets the pace? Who determines when meaning is assigned? Provocation attempts to steal that authority by compressing time. Sovereignty restores it by refusing the false deadline. Not responding immediately does not erase you. It makes you opaque, and opacity is destabilizing to systems that depend on extraction. This is not about withholding. It is about not being rushed out of yourself. What provocation cannot touch, provocation can touch sensation. It can touch memory. It can touch identity cues. But there is one thing it cannot touch unless you give it access: your timing. Timing is the last frontier of autonomy. As long as you can feel without acting, notice without explaining, and pause without disappearing, provocation remains incomplete. This episode is not an invitation to disengage from life. It is an invitation to stop being harvested by urgency. You are allowed to feel the spike and remain still. You are allowed to sense the charge and say nothing. You are allowed to let meaning arrive later. These allowances do not make you passive. They make you unavailable for extraction, and that is enough. When tension becomes invitation. Provocation creates tension, but tension is uncomfortable. Systems that rely on influence rarely leave tension unresolved for long. After the strike comes something softer, something reassuring, something that promises relief. This is where seduction enters. Seduction does not demand reaction. It invites surrender. It does not spike the nervous system. It narcotizes it. Where provocation tightens the system, seduction loosens it. Where provocation heats, seduction warms. Where provocation sharpens attention, seduction blurs it. In the next episode, we will examine how safety is simulated, how boundaries soften without consent, and how the nervous system can be guided into compliance through comfort rather than threat. Episode 6: Seduction, the narcotic softening of the vagal shield. Thank you for entering this field of exploration. The matrix is not something you escape. It is something you learn to feel and perceive. Once you begin to recognize it through feeling and self-awareness, perception becomes less confined by certainty and more guided by awareness. You've been listening to the Resonance Matrix Volume 2, The Anatomy of Influence and the Linguistic Somatic Decode, Episode 5, Provocation. I'm James Miller.